In the heart of a kingdom once thought unshakable, the corridors of power were not guarded by walls alone. They were guarded by whispers, by loyalty bought and sold in silence, by ambition that could neither be named nor denied. Here, in the opulent halls of a reigning king, one man would change the course of history, not with armies, nor with war, but with intellect, cunning, and patient strategy. This is the story of an advisor. A man whose knowledge of human nature, of court intrigue, and of the weaknesses of kings themselves, would ultimately overturn centuries of tradition. A man who understood that the most formidable power is often invisible, wielded not through force, but through persuasion. The kingdom, nestled between fertile plains and strategic mountain passes, had endured decades of relative peace. Its king, celebrated for victories on the battlefield and for the wisdom of his counsel, was nonetheless deeply flawed. The crown, heavy as it was with the weight of authority, bore a man who trusted too easily, who surrounded himself with yes-men, and who underestimated the quiet ambition of those closest to him. For years, the king had ruled with an iron hand, yet his kingdom was not immune to the forces that erode even the most stable thrones: envy, greed, and fear. Within this delicate balance, one advisor emerged, unremarkable at first glance, yet possessed of an uncanny ability to read the currents of power and the fragility of loyalty. Little is known of his youth, but fragments suggest a man of extraordinary intelligence and unyielding patience. Unlike those who seek fame or fortune openly, he cultivated subtle influence, weaving alliances in shadows where others saw only emptiness. He studied the habits of courtiers, the inclinations of generals, and even the unspoken fears of the king himself. Every gesture, every hesitation, became a thread he could pull when the time was right. As the kingdom prospered, cracks appeared, not in the walls, nor in the treasury, but in the human fabric of power. Rival nobles, ambitious ministers, and a king increasingly isolated by his own hubris began to question his judgment. It was here, in this fertile ground of dissatisfaction, that the advisor began to sow his influence. Subtle acts at first, advice whispered at the right moment, secrets revealed with careful discretion, favors extended to key figures. Each maneuver was calculated, each risk weighed against the potential gain. Power, he understood, is never absolute. It flows through people, through loyalty and fear, through shared secrets and mutual advantage. The advisor cultivated a network that reached every level of the court: generals, scribes, merchants, even the king's inner circle of confidants. Each connection was more than a relationship, it was a lever. And levers, he knew, can move empires. By the time the king noticed, the advisor had already become indispensable. A subtle manipulation here, a concealed truth there. Decisions once thought to be the king's own were, in reality, guided by a hand unseen. And yet, the king did not see the danger. His trust in this man became both his shield and his undoing. The fall of kings, history shows us, rarely comes in a single, dramatic stroke. It is a slow erosion, a sequence of choices made under the illusion of control. And the advisor, ever patient, was orchestrating that erosion with the precision of a master strategist. The advisor believed that power is a living thing. It cannot be seized in one violent act, nor can it be demanded. It must be cultivated, nurtured, and, when the time is right, harvested. He viewed every interaction as a transaction, every whisper as currency. To the untrained eye, he was merely a servant of the king, a loyal counselor. But in the shadows, he was something far more dangerous, a manipulator of destiny. The first cracks in the king's authority were invisible. A suggestion here, a misdirection there, and soon allies of the crown began to question their ruler. The advisor would highlight minor failures, exaggerate small setbacks, and frame the king's decisions as flawed, not openly, but subtly enough to shift perception. History often remembers revolutions as sudden, dramatic events. Yet in truth, most falls of kings are orchestrated long before the crown is touched. By the time rumors of incompetence reached the palace gates, the king himself had begun to doubt his own judgment. Every action reinforced the perception that the advisor alone understood the kingdom's true path. Slowly, he became the axis on which the entire court turned. No king rules alone. Behind the throne are factions, ambitious nobles, rival generals, influential merchants, and even religious authorities. The advisor studied each faction, identifying who could be persuaded, who could be threatened, and who could be ignored. By exploiting rivalries, he ensured that the king's supporters were divided, often distracted by petty feuds or promises of greater reward. A divided court is a vulnerable court, and vulnerability is the doorway to power. As the advisor's influence grew, the king became increasingly isolated. Decisions once shared among trusted counselors were now filtered through the advisor. Messages were delayed, intelligence skewed, and advice manipulated to favor the advisor's vision. The more the king relied on the advisor, the more blind he became to the erosion around him. And this isolation was no accident, it was carefully engineered. Every master strategist needs a moment of triumph, a visible success that cements their credibility. For the advisor, this came not through war, but diplomacy. This achievement made him indispensable. The court celebrated the king's wisdom, unaware that the advisor had orchestrated the entire outcome. From this moment, the advisor was no longer a mere counselor. He was the invisible architect of power. With each subtle victory, the advisor cultivated an image of infallibility. His guidance appeared prescient, his warnings prophetic. Even those skeptical at first began to defer to his judgment. In politics, perception often outweighs reality. The advisor understood that controlling perception is controlling history itself. Yet, all manipulation carries risk. The king, though increasingly dependent, began to notice contradictions in reports, inconsistencies in loyalty, and faint glimmers of dissatisfaction among his closest allies. Paranoia, once a subtle seed, can blossom into dangerous indecision. For the king, this doubt was both inevitable and unavoidable, planted expertly by the very man he trusted most. The advisor knew that patience was the ultimate weapon. Every misstep, every factional tension, every subtle doubt in the king's mind was recorded and catalogued for later use. The stage was set. The players were in place. And soon, the moment would arrive when the balance of power would tip irreversibly. History often remembers the dramatic coup, the sword drawn, the banners lowered, the throne seized. But real power is far quieter. It is invisible. It is patient. It is relentless. And for one advisor, it was already his. Power does not announce itself when it changes hands. It drifts. It migrates. It settles quietly in new places long before anyone dares to name it. By the time the kingdom sensed that something was wrong, the balance had already shifted beyond recovery. The advisor understood this better than anyone. He had no interest in spectacle. Spectacle invites resistance. What he sought instead was inevitability, the feeling among the court that events were unfolding according to forces larger than any single man, including the king himself. On the surface, nothing appeared unusual. Markets opened. Officials conducted business. The king held court. Yet beneath this calm exterior, alliances were hardening, loyalties were being reassigned, and the authority of the crown was being hollowed out from within. The advisor's most effective weapon was not deception, but dependency. He ensured that the king's decisions increasingly relied on information only he could provide. Reports from distant provinces passed through his hands first. Military assessments were summarized, filtered, and framed. Diplomatic correspondence arrived selectively, often stripped of context that might empower independent judgment. The king did not lose power all at once. He lost it in fragments, small pieces surrendered in moments of fatigue, trust, and routine. With each passing month, the king consulted the advisor not merely for counsel, but for confirmation. Confirmation that his instincts were sound. Confirmation that his fears were justified. Confirmation that his rivals were disloyal. And each confirmation came at a cost. Fear is more potent than loyalty. The advisor knew this. He began to subtly reframe the king's worldview, presenting threats as more imminent, conspiracies as more widespread, dissent as more dangerous than it truly was. The king's confidence gave way to vigilance, and vigilance to suspicion. The advisor never invented enemies outright. That would have been reckless. Instead, he magnified existing tensions. A disgruntled noble became a potential traitor. A cautious general became unreliable. A neutral official became dangerously ambiguous. In an atmosphere of fear, neutrality is indistinguishable from betrayal. The king began to act preemptively, removing long-serving allies, sidelining experienced commanders, and concentrating authority in fewer hands. Each decision, though seemingly justified, weakened the very foundation of his rule. And every removal created a vacancy the advisor was ready to fill. As the king's suspicion grew, the court fractured. Nobles who once collaborated now competed for survival. Ministers sought proximity to the advisor, understanding that his favor carried more weight than royal approval. Silence replaced candor. Flattery replaced counsel. A ruler who cannot hear the truth is already dethroned in all but name. The advisor encouraged this environment subtly, rewarding obedience and punishing dissent not with violence, but with exclusion. Invitations ceased. Messages went unanswered. Careers stalled. The court learned quickly. To consolidate control, the advisor cultivated the appearance of unanimity. Council meetings became performances. Carefully selected voices echoed the advisor's recommendations. Opposing perspectives were absent, not because they no longer existed, but because they no longer felt safe to speak. The king mistook silence for unity. This was the advisor's greatest triumph, convincing the ruler that the kingdom was aligned, even as it quietly slipped from his grasp. Every long campaign requires sacrifice. When unrest finally erupted in a distant province, an inevitable outcome of neglect and mismanagement, the advisor seized the opportunity. Responsibility was redirected toward a trusted royal appointee, a man loyal to the crown but expendable to the advisor's plans. The king, under pressure and desperate to reassert control, approved the dismissal. With a single decision, the king lost another pillar of legitimacy, and gained another enemy. The dismissed official did not disappear. He joined a growing circle of the disaffected, former allies, sidelined commanders, marginalized nobles. A shadow opposition began to form, unaware that they were being guided as carefully as the court itself. Amid growing instability, the advisor positioned himself as the sole constant. When unrest spread, he offered solutions. When revenues declined, he proposed reforms. When loyalty wavered, he recommended decisive action. Each intervention reinforced the perception that without him, the kingdom would collapse. He was no longer merely advising the king. He was governing through him. Foreign envoys began to seek audiences with the advisor directly. Military leaders deferred to his judgment. Even religious authorities acknowledged his influence. The crown still sat upon the king's head, but the weight of governance rested elsewhere. The king, sensing the erosion of his authority yet unable to name its source, made his final mistake. He centralized power further. By granting the advisor expanded authority to act on his behalf, the king believed he was restoring order. In reality, he was formalizing his own irrelevance. History is unkind to rulers who confuse delegation with control. With legal authority now matching practical influence, the advisor no longer needed secrecy. The transition from counselor to ruler was nearly complete. There was no night of chaos. No storming of the palace. No bloodshed in the halls. The overthrow unfolded through procedure. A council convened under emergency authority. Loyalists were absent. A motion was raised questioning the king's fitness to rule. Evidence, carefully curated over years, was presented. Fear did the rest. When the vote was called, the outcome was never in doubt. The king was informed privately. He protested weakly, invoking tradition, legacy, divine right. None of it mattered. Power had already moved on. The king lived. He was permitted dignity, comfort, and silence. A ruler in name no longer, preserved as a symbol of continuity rather than authority. The advisor assumed leadership not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker, at least in title. Stability was restored. Order returned. The machinery of state continued uninterrupted. History would later debate whether the advisor was a villain or a necessity. Some would argue that the kingdom prospered under his rule. Others would point to the moral cost of manipulation and betrayal. But one truth remains indisputable. The king was not defeated by force. He was undone by trust. And the advisor did not seize power. He inherited it, piece by piece, decision by decision, until there was nothing left to take. In every age, there are rulers who command armies, and advisors who command outcomes. The fall of this king serves as a reminder that power does not always sit where we expect it to. Sometimes, it stands quietly at the ruler's side, waiting. When a king falls without bloodshed, history often struggles to name the moment it happened. There is no single image to preserve, no battlefield, no execution, no burning palace. Instead, there is paperwork. Silence. Continuity. And a population that wakes up to find the same banners flying, unaware that the meaning behind them has changed. The advisor understood that legitimacy is not seized, it is assumed. His first acts were deliberately unremarkable. Taxes were collected as before. Courts remained open. Religious ceremonies continued uninterrupted. To the outside world, the kingdom appeared stable, perhaps even relieved. The illusion of normalcy was essential. Disorder invites scrutiny. Stability breeds acceptance. The advisor's next task was not governance, but memory. He commissioned official chronicles, subtly reframing recent events. The king's removal was described not as a loss of power, but as a dignified withdrawal, an act of wisdom in the face of mounting challenges. The advisor's role was presented as reluctant stewardship, a burden accepted for the good of the realm. History is rarely written by those who fall. It is curated by those who remain. Public declarations emphasized unity, continuity, and collective responsibility. There was no mention of manipulation, no acknowledgement of engineered fear. The past was smoothed, simplified, and rendered harmless. Over time, the story hardened into fact. Yet power is never uncontested. The advisor knew that those sidelined during the king's final years, former allies, dismissed officials, overlooked nobles, posed the greatest threat. Rather than purge them, he absorbed them. Some were offered symbolic positions, stripped of influence but granted dignity. Others were sent abroad as envoys, far from the center of power. A few were quietly monitored, their movements restricted by invisible boundaries. A smart ruler does not eliminate enemies when he can neutralize them. By denying his rivals a cause, the advisor denied them momentum. For the first time, the advisor stood alone at the summit. There was no king above him, no figure to shield him from blame or absorb public frustration. Every success was now his responsibility. Every failure, his fault. The irony of power is that as it concentrates, it isolates. The very techniques that elevated him, secrecy, control, manipulation, now limited his ability to trust. Advisors spoke carefully. Ministers avoided candor. The atmosphere he had cultivated for the king had become his own. To compensate, the advisor turned to structure. He reformed administrative systems, reducing reliance on individual personalities. Authority was redistributed across councils, committees, and offices, all ultimately accountable to him. Decisions became procedural, resistance bureaucratic. Where fear once enforced loyalty, process now ensured obedience. The state no longer depended on persuasion alone. It ran on momentum. Beyond the kingdom's borders, reactions were cautious. Neighboring rulers recognized the advisor's competence but distrusted his assent. Diplomats noted the absence of turmoil, and the absence of a crown. Treaties were renegotiated. Alliances recalibrated. Foreign powers care less about legitimacy than predictability. As long as trade flowed and borders held, questions of morality remained academic. Meanwhile, the former king faded from public life. At first, his name appeared in ceremonial contexts. Then less frequently. Eventually, not at all. New generations grew up knowing him only as a footnote, a ruler whose reign ended peacefully. Oblivion is often the final punishment of dethroned rulers. He had not been executed. He had been erased. Years passed. The advisor ruled efficiently, if coldly. The kingdom prospered in measurable ways. Infrastructure expanded. Revenue stabilized. Order prevailed. But something intangible was lost. Fear may create order, but it cannot inspire loyalty. Citizens obeyed, but they did not believe. Officials complied, but they did not commit. The state functioned, yet lacked the shared myth that binds ruler and ruled. And then, quietly, the cycle began again. A new generation of aides emerged, capable, observant, patient. They learned by watching. They absorbed the same lessons the advisor once had. Power teaches even when it does not intend to. In time, the advisor noticed familiar signs: filtered information, delayed reports, unanimous counsels. The very methods he had perfected now reflected back at him. History does not judge ambition. It records outcomes. This was not the story of a weak king, nor of an evil advisor. It was the story of proximity to power, and what prolonged exposure does to those who stand closest to it. Kings fall when they mistake trust for loyalty. Advisors rise when they understand that influence, not authority, is the true currency of rule. Empires do not always collapse under invasion or rebellion. Sometimes, they change hands quietly, guided by those who were never meant to rule, yet learned how, by watching those who did. And somewhere, in every seat of power, there is always someone listening, waiting. The figure of the advisor who eclipses the ruler is not an anomaly. It is a recurring pattern, one that appears whenever power is concentrated, personalized, and shielded from scrutiny. Across centuries and civilizations, courts have produced individuals who mastered proximity rather than authority, influence rather than command. What made this advisor successful was not cruelty, nor brilliance alone, but timing. He emerged at a moment when institutions were fragile, when the king's legitimacy depended more on perception than consensus, and when governance had become too complex for one man to fully control. In such moments, advisors thrive. They translate chaos into clarity, uncertainty into direction. And in doing so, they become indispensable. The advisor's rule did not rely on decrees or spectacle. It relied on mechanisms, systems designed to outlast individuals. Appointments were framed as meritocratic. Policies were justified as pragmatic. Resistance was portrayed as destabilizing. Over time, the language of governance shifted subtly but decisively. When words change, reality soon follows. What had once been called loyalty became efficiency. What had once been dissent became obstruction. The vocabulary of power was re-engineered, narrowing the range of acceptable thought. This was not repression in its crude form. It was normalization. For the common people, the transition was almost imperceptible. Taxes were predictable. Laws were enforced consistently. Roads were maintained. Stability, for many, outweighed questions of legitimacy. Most societies do not revolt against order. They adapt to it. Festivals continued. Religious rites persisted. The ruler's name changed, but daily life did not. Over time, memory softened. What once felt unusual became routine. And routine, more than ideology, anchors power. One consequence of the advisor's ascent was the absence of a unifying symbol. Kings embody myth. They are vessels of tradition, ancestry, divine sanction. Advisors do not inherit these narratives. They must compensate with performance and results. Efficiency filled the space where symbolism once lived. Yet efficiency cannot replace meaning. Without ritualized authority, loyalty became transactional. Support was conditional. Obedience had limits. The state grew stronger, but thinner. As years passed, fractures appeared, not in governance, but in cohesion. Provincial leaders complied, but increasingly pursued local interests. Military commanders followed orders, but cultivated personal loyalty among troops. Bureaucrats protected procedures rather than principles. A system built on control must constantly expand that control to survive. The advisor responded with oversight bodies, audits, and layered approval structures. Each reform tightened discipline, and deepened distance between ruler and ruled. What the advisor never fully grasped was that his greatest strength had become his greatest weakness. He had risen by understanding human behavior, fear, ambition, insecurity. But power had insulated him from those same signals. Reports were polished. Dissent was softened. Reality arrived filtered. No ruler is immune to the gravity of their own authority. The silence he once cultivated now surrounded him. Within the apparatus he built, a new class of officials emerged. They had known no king. They had never witnessed the advisor's ascent. To them, power was procedural, not personal. They did not seek to overthrow him. They sought to optimize him away. Decisions were delayed by committee. Authority diffused through regulation. Influence became harder to trace. The advisor found himself constrained, not by rebellion, but by the very structures he had created. There was no dramatic end. No trial. No exile. No uprising. The advisor aged. His presence diminished. Responsibilities were delegated. Authority migrated once more, this time into institutions rather than individuals. The final irony of absolute influence is that it prepares the world to function without you. When he died, the state did not pause. It continued. Centuries later, historians would debate his legacy. Some would credit him with preserving the kingdom during a vulnerable era. Others would argue that he extinguished a vital political tradition. Still others would see him as neither hero nor villain, but as an expression of systemic failure. Individuals do not create these moments alone. They step into spaces history has already hollowed out. The story of the advisor who overthrew a king is not ultimately about ambition. It is about access. Those who control information control decisions. Those who shape decisions shape outcomes. And those who shape outcomes, in time, shape history. Crowns attract attention. Advisors attract opportunity. And when power is left unexamined, it rarely disappears. It simply changes hands. After power has been secured, after resistance has been neutralized and order restored, there comes a quieter phase, one rarely explored in chronicles. It is the moment when history stops accelerating and begins to settle. For the advisor, this period was neither triumphant nor restful. It was simply heavy. Power, once achieved, demands maintenance. It erodes attention. It dulls instinct. And it replaces ambition with caution. The advisor no longer needed to persuade. He needed to preserve. That difference changed everything. Under the king, rule had been theatrical. Ceremony reinforced hierarchy. Authority was visible, embodied, ritualized. Under the advisor, rule became technical. Decisions were justified by data. Policies were explained through necessity. Authority was embedded in process rather than presence. This was governance stripped of romance. The court adapted. The population adapted. But something ineffable disappeared, the sense that power was more than management. The advisor ruled efficiently, yet invisibly. And invisibility, while useful for assent, proved limiting in longevity. As advisor, he had once stood apart from consequences. As ruler, there was no distance left. Famines were no longer policy failures, they were his failures. Rebellions were no longer miscalculations, they were indictments. Every outcome reflected back on him without buffer. There is no insulation at the top. He responded with restraint. Violence was avoided. Punishments were measured. But restraint, too, has limits. Without symbolic authority, restraint was often mistaken for weakness. The most dangerous opposition did not organize in secret councils or distant provinces. It formed quietly in thought. Officials complied but withheld enthusiasm. Citizens obeyed but disengaged emotionally. Loyalty became shallow. A state can survive without love, but it cannot thrive without belief. The advisor sensed this erosion but struggled to reverse it. Myth cannot be manufactured retroactively. Legitimacy must precede control, not follow it. Old stories resurfaced. Songs referencing the king's era circulated quietly. Family histories repeated older loyalties. Nostalgia filled the void left by meaning. Memory, when denied a place in power, becomes a form of resistance. The advisor did not suppress these expressions. He understood their danger, but also their inevitability. Suppression would give them shape. Tolerance would let them fade. Some did. Others did not. The systems designed to ensure stability began to slow themselves. Oversight bred delay. Committees bred ambiguity. Rules bred loopholes. Bureaucracy, once a tool of control, became a force of inertia. The advisor found himself negotiating with structures rather than commanding them. Authority diffused, but responsibility remained concentrated. It was a familiar pattern, one he recognized too late. In his later years, the advisor turned to historical texts, not to justify his actions, but to understand them. He found echoes everywhere: stewards who eclipsed monarchs, ministers who ruled in all but name, caretakers who became sovereigns without crowns. History did not condemn them. It absorbed them. Their names survived not as founders, but as transitions. When the advisor's health declined, the response was orderly. Deputies assumed duties. Protocols activated. Governance continued uninterrupted. There were no mass gatherings. No public grief. No fear of collapse. The system did not need him anymore. And that, perhaps, was his greatest achievement, and his final displacement. Following his death, no single figure replaced him. Authority distributed itself across councils, offices, and laws. The kingdom entered a new phase, not monarchic, not personal, but administrative. The advisor did not found a dynasty. He dissolved one. What replaced it was something quieter, colder, and harder to challenge. The story of the advisor who overthrew a king resists moral clarity. He was not driven by cruelty, nor blinded by vanity. He was driven by competence in a system that no longer rewarded symbolism. The king fell not because he was weak, but because the world no longer needed what he represented. And the advisor rose not because he sought the throne, but because he understood how power truly moved. In every era, power drifts toward those who interpret reality most effectively. Not those who inherit authority, but those who manage uncertainty. Crowns may endure as objects, titles may survive as tradition. But power itself belongs to those closest to the moment where decisions are made. And those figures, more often than not, are never meant to rule. When a society outgrows its ruler, it does not announce the transition. It adapts. Slowly, quietly, almost instinctively. The kingdom that emerged after the advisor's era no longer resembled the realm he had inherited from the king. It was more stable, more predictable, and far less personal. The absence of a singular figure at the center of power reshaped political life. Authority no longer flowed from a face or a lineage. It flowed from procedure. For the people, this shift was confusing rather than revolutionary. Children grew up without stories of coronations. Festivals lost their central figure. The old rituals continued, but hollowed out, performed because they always had been. A society can function without a monarch, but it struggles to remember why it exists. Public loyalty fragmented. Individuals pledged allegiance not to the state as a whole, but to professions, regions, guilds, and institutions. Identity narrowed. The advisor's reforms had created order. They had not created belonging. A new political class emerged, men and women trained not in court etiquette, but in administration. They spoke the language of budgets, logistics, and outcomes. They did not dream of power. They applied for it. Ideology faded. Ambition became technical. Governance transformed into a career rather than a calling. The advisor had unintentionally redesigned the nature of leadership itself. Under the king, counsel had been intimate. Conversations unfolded in private chambers, shaped by trust, personality, and shared history. Under the advisor's system, counsel became collective. Wisdom was averaged. No single voice carried decisive weight. Decisions improved in consistency, but lost depth. Risk-taking diminished. Innovation slowed. Stability, once achieved, resisted change. Time, however, does not pause for efficient systems. Foreign powers evolved. Trade routes shifted. New military technologies emerged. The kingdom faced challenges that demanded vision, not management. Procedures can respond, but they cannot imagine. Without a central figure to redefine purpose, the state reacted rather than led. It preserved rather than transformed. The shadow of the old monarchy lingered, not as nostalgia, but as an unanswered question. Generations later, scholars and officials revisited the kingdom's past. They studied the fall of the king, the rise of the advisor, the long plateau that followed. They did not ask who was right. They asked what was lost. Debate returned, not about restoring a king, but about restoring meaning. What became clear was that power never disappears. It concentrates. It diffuses. It migrates. The advisor had not ended monarchy. He had interrupted it. The conditions that allowed his rise, complex governance, information asymmetry, institutional fragility, began to reappear in new forms. Different titles. Same dynamics. In official history, the advisor was remembered as a stabilizer. In private memory, he was remembered as a warning. He proved that intelligence without accountability can outperform tradition, but cannot replace it. He demonstrated that influence can dismantle authority, but struggles to create it anew. The overthrow of a king by an advisor does not require betrayal in the dramatic sense. It requires alignment. Alignment between fear and opportunity. Between access and ambition. Between silence and consent. When these elements converge, the throne becomes irrelevant long before it is vacated. Every political system contains within it the conditions of its own transformation. Rulers who delegate without oversight invite replacement. Advisors who understand systems better than symbols invite transition. The story told here is not ancient. It is ongoing. Wherever leaders depend on intermediaries to interpret reality, power quietly relocates. The crown remains, untouched, admired, preserved. But history reminds us that it was never the crown that ruled. It was always the hands nearest to decision. And those hands, more often than not, belonged to someone standing just out of sight. Long after the advisor's name faded from daily speech, the consequences of his ascent continued to shape the kingdom's political instincts. Power had learned to disguise itself. Authority had learned to speak softly. And governance had learned to survive without spectacle. This was the advisor's most enduring legacy. The kingdom no longer believed in sudden change. It distrusted dramatic leaders. It preferred continuity over charisma, caution over conviction. Those who came to govern after the advisor inherited more than institutions. They inherited a mindset. Every leader was assumed temporary. Every promise was treated as provisional. Ambition became something to conceal rather than declare. Those who rose too quickly were watched. Those who spoke too boldly were sidelined. The memory of the advisor lingered, not as admiration, but as a quiet warning. Influence was respected. Authority was questioned. The most subtle casualty of the advisor's era was trust. Not trust between citizens and the state, that had always been conditional, but trust within power itself. Officials guarded information. Councils protected jurisdictions. Cooperation required documentation. When power is won through maneuver, it teaches others to maneuver as well. Governance slowed. Decisions accumulated layers. Responsibility blurred. No single figure could be blamed. No single figure could inspire. The kingdom endured. It did not collapse. It did not fracture. It persisted in a long, controlled equilibrium. This was not decline. It was stagnation. Prosperity plateaued. Innovation hesitated. Risk was avoided not because it was dangerous, but because it was visible. The state had learned how to survive. It had forgotten how to aspire. Across generations, memory returned in altered forms. Artists referenced forgotten kings. Philosophers questioned the nature of legitimacy. Students studied the advisor not as a man, but as a moment. History, when suppressed, does not disappear. It re-emerges as inquiry. The question was no longer who should rule, but how power should justify itself. Ironically, the advisor became what the king once was, a symbol. Not of authority, but of transition. He represented the moment when proximity defeated inheritance, when intelligence overcame tradition, when control replaced belief. His story was taught not as a cautionary tale, but as a diagnostic one, a way to understand how systems fail quietly. The kingdom was not unique. Elsewhere, similar stories unfolded. Ministers eclipsed monarchs. Technocrats replaced ideologues. Advisors became arbiters. The names changed. The mechanics did not. Wherever information pooled in narrow channels, power followed. Wherever rulers relied on intermediaries to interpret reality, authority thinned. The advisor was not an exception. He was an expression. Centuries later, one question remained unresolved. Could the king have survived? Perhaps, if he had understood that delegation requires oversight, that loyalty requires transparency, that advisors must be constrained as carefully as enemies. But history does not reward hypotheticals. It records outcomes. The throne, once physical and symbolic, became abstract. It existed wherever decisions were finalized, wherever information converged, wherever consequences were assigned. Power had become mobile. It could sit anywhere. The overthrow of a king by an advisor is not a story of betrayal. It is a story of neglect. Neglect of boundaries. Neglect of accountability. Neglect of the quiet accumulation of influence. Kings fall when they stop asking who benefits from their trust. Advisors rise when no one is watching them closely enough. History remembers crowns because they shine. But power prefers shadows. And in those shadows, patiently, it waits for permission to move. In the generations that followed, the kingdom developed an unusual resilience. Crises came and went, economic shocks, border disputes, internal unrest, but none threatened the state's existence. Power had learned how to absorb impact. It bent rather than broke. Yet resilience is not the same as vitality. What emerged was a political culture shaped less by ideals than by habit. Decisions were made because they had always been made that way. Authority persisted because no alternative had been clearly imagined. The advisor's greatest legacy was not control, it was routine. Over time, the language of power grew narrower. Words like destiny, mandate, and sovereignty faded from official use. They were replaced by terms such as compliance, optimization, and continuity. When language shrinks, imagination follows. Debate became technical. Disagreement became procedural. Politics, once a contest of visions, turned into a contest of interpretations. No one spoke of overthrow anymore, only reform. Those who rose within this system did not aspire to rule. They aspired to manage. Ambition had been reframed as recklessness. Candidates for leadership emphasized caution, restraint, and predictability. They promised stability rather than change, maintenance rather than renewal. The memory of the advisor loomed over them all, not as a threat, but as a boundary. Ironically, while authority appeared diffused, real power slowly reconsolidated, not in a single figure, but in small circles of expertise. Those who controlled metrics controlled outcomes. Data replaced counsel. Analysis replaced judgment. Decisions were justified as inevitable results of models rather than choices made by people. Responsibility became abstract. Citizens participated less, not because they were oppressed, but because participation felt irrelevant. When outcomes appear predetermined, engagement fades. Voting continued. Assemblies met. Public forums existed. But enthusiasm declined. Politics became background noise. The state functioned. The people watched. Eventually, a new generation asked an old question in a new way. Why obey? Not out of defiance, but curiosity. They had known only efficiency. They had inherited order without origin. They lived in a system that worked, yet struggled to explain itself. The advisor's era returned to relevance, not as history, but as diagnosis. Scholars revisited the king's reign with fresh eyes. They no longer mocked his weakness. They studied his isolation. They recognized that the king had not lost power because he was incompetent, but because power had outgrown the symbols meant to contain it. His failure was structural, not personal. Likewise, the advisor was no longer judged solely by his actions. He was understood as a product of transition. He stepped into a vacuum created by complexity, opacity, and delegated authority. Had he not risen, someone else would have. Slowly, deliberately, the kingdom began to ask what kind of power it wanted. Not who should rule, but how rule should feel. Should authority inspire, or merely function? Should leadership be visible, or simply effective? These were questions no system could answer alone. The overthrow of the king was not a conclusion. It was a hinge. Before it, power wore a face. After it, power wore a system. And systems, unlike people, do not age, repent, or remember. They persist, until challenged by imagination. Wherever authority is delegated without oversight, advisors rise. Wherever information concentrates, power follows. Wherever rulers stop asking who shapes their decisions, the throne empties itself. This story belongs to no single kingdom. It belongs to every place where power is close enough to touch, and far enough away to deny. Long after names are forgotten, systems remain. They persist not because they are loved, but because they are familiar. In the kingdom shaped by the advisor's quiet ascendancy, power had become something inherited without inheritance, passed down not through bloodlines, but through habits of thought. Children were taught procedures before principles. Officials learned compliance before conviction. The state endured, but it no longer remembered why it had been formed in the first place. The advisor's shadow did not loom because it was feared. It lingered because it had never been fully examined. Impersonal rule brought comfort. No ruler's mood could alter law. No single failure could collapse authority. The system absorbed emotion and returned neutrality. In a world shaped by uncertainty, impersonality feels safe. Citizens no longer expected inspiration from leadership. They expected consistency. That expectation was met, and in being met repeatedly, it reshaped political desire itself. Hope was replaced by predictability. Yet predictability has a price. When outcomes become expected, progress slows. When risk is avoided, transformation stalls. Great change requires friction. This system was designed to eliminate it. Innovation emerged only at the margins. Visionaries learned to soften ideas into proposals, proposals into reports, reports into delays. The state preserved itself expertly, and reinvented itself poorly. The advisor had once ruled without a crown. His successors ruled without faces. When power becomes collective, blame becomes optional. Failures were attributed to circumstances. Successes to process. Individuals faded from consequence. The people sensed this intuitively. Trust did not collapse, but it thinned, stretched across too many layers to feel personal. Opposition did not gather in streets or councils. It appeared in apathy. The most silent form of resistance is disengagement. Citizens complied, but no longer invested. The state became something one lived under, not within. Participation was ritual. Belief was private. Unintentionally, the advisor had proven something profound. Power does not need legitimacy to function. But legitimacy needs power to endure. By separating the two, he created a state that worked, but did not belong. History, however, is cyclical. In moments of prolonged stagnation, societies begin to seek figures again. Voices, faces, narratives. When systems grow too quiet, people listen for someone to speak. Charismatic figures emerged at the edges of political life. They did not challenge the system directly. They questioned its emptiness. They spoke not of overthrow, but of meaning. These figures were not advisors. They had no proximity to power. Their danger lay elsewhere. They offered identity. The system, built to manage outcomes, struggled to respond. Procedures could not neutralize belief. Committees could not absorb emotion. For the first time in generations, power encountered something it could not easily process. Observers noted the irony. The kingdom now faced a challenge opposite to the one that had dethroned the king. Then, power had moved inward, away from symbolism. Now, symbolism threatened to move power outward again. The advisor's legacy had reached its limit. No chronicles record what followed in definitive terms. Some say the system adapted. Others say it fractured. Still others claim it transformed, quietly, as it always had. What matters is not the outcome, but the pattern. Power never rests. It oscillates between person and process, belief and efficiency, visibility and control. In the end, the king and the advisor were not opposites. They were phases. One represented inherited authority struggling with complexity. The other represented managed authority struggling with meaning. Neither was complete. Neither was permanent. History is not a sequence of rulers. It is a sequence of arrangements. And every arrangement contains the conditions for its undoing. The advisor overthrew the king not by force, but by understanding the moment better than anyone else. And one day, someone else will do the same. Centuries later, historians would look back at the kingdom and marvel, not at battles, treaties, or revolutions, but at the subtle art of influence that reshaped it. The advisor's methods had become institutionalized, a blueprint for how power moves quietly, invisibly, almost imperceptibly. Power, as the advisor demonstrated, does not always reside in the crown, the throne, or even the ruler. It resides in the hands that know how to navigate the machinery of decision before anyone else. The machinery the advisor built became self-sustaining. Councils functioned, committees deliberated, and officers processed decisions long after his death. Individuals could no longer manipulate outcomes through charm alone. Control had shifted to process. Power had become a system. Efficiency replaced inspiration. Calculation replaced intuition. And while the kingdom survived, it lost the vibrant unpredictability that once animated leadership. Even rebellion was muted. Where once a dissatisfied noble could rally followers, now bureaucracy neutralized dissent before it gained momentum. Efficiency became a weapon of control. The advisor's true genius lay in patience. He waited for the king to create vulnerabilities, then nudged events in the right direction. He did not force change, he engineered inevitability. The lesson: power is often seized not in violence, but in the careful shaping of perception, allegiance, and expectation. By the time the kingdom realized that control had shifted, it was too late. The king's authority was intact in appearance, but hollow in effect. This pattern repeats across history. From the court of imperial China to Renaissance Italy, from European regencies to modern bureaucracies, advisors emerge not merely to counsel but to govern indirectly. They wield influence where symbols of authority fail. Authority may be inherited, but influence must be cultivated. And influence, once consolidated, is often harder to dislodge than armies or laws. Kingship is fragile when its power depends on perception rather than structure. Ceremonial authority is easy to claim. Substantive control is far harder to maintain. The advisor understood this intuitively. The crown is nothing without the machinery that enforces it, and even that machinery can be turned if it is guided carefully enough. In every system, those closest to decisions, not the visible figurehead, shape the future. Over decades, the kingdom adapted to its new form. It became a living organism, less dependent on singular leadership, more dependent on networks, procedure, and compliance. Decisions were diffused. Power was anonymized. Responsibility was encoded in law rather than person. The advisor's influence endured not through memory, but through structure. Even as rulers changed, the system endured, maintaining continuity without charisma, and stability without inspiration. Yet this efficiency came at a price. The advisor had succeeded, but the people, the officials, the generals, the citizens, experienced alienation. Leadership became functional rather than meaningful. Participation became compliance rather than engagement. Tradition persisted, but significance eroded. History often measures success in survival. But survival is not the same as vitality. The advisor himself became myth. Not celebrated as a hero, nor condemned as a villain, he was remembered as a force of inevitability, the one who shifted power without drawing a sword, who remade authority without ceremony, who taught history that influence often outweighs position. The advisor proved that control is a shadow, not a throne. That power moves quietly, inexorably, and often invisibly. To understand the advisor's rise, one must look beyond events and examine the principles of power itself. Authority is more than ceremony, more than violence, more than tradition. It is a living negotiation between perception, influence, and consent. And influence, as history repeatedly demonstrates, often outlasts crowns. The advisor understood what rulers often forget. Proximity to decisions is more potent than proximity to symbolism. The hand that whispers direction often holds more sway than the hand that signs decrees. Across time and space, similar patterns emerge. In Renaissance Florence, the Medici advisors subtly guided dukes while consolidating financial and political control. In imperial China, eunuchs and ministers wielded authority behind the emperor's throne. Even in modern parliamentary states, unelected bureaucrats shape policy more than elected officials ever can. The mechanism is always the same: control the flow of information, shape perception, and ensure dependency. The king of our story was not exceptional. He was ordinary in assuming that authority alone would protect him. The advisor was extraordinary in exploiting that assumption. Influence is subtle. It is a series of incremental advantages compounded over time. Trust is both the tool and the trap. Those who earn it slowly become indispensable. Those who give it recklessly surrender control. The advisor cultivated dependence with precision. Reports, recommendations, confirmations. Each small act positioned him as the sole reliable interpreter of reality. The king, surrounded by complexity, began to mistake guidance for wisdom, counsel for truth, and loyalty for alignment. Over years, this reliance created a cognitive lock. The king's judgment became inseparable from the advisor's framing. Decisions that might have asserted authority instead reinforced dependency. Unlike rebellions or palace intrigues, the advisor's coup was invisible. There were no banners, no armies, no violent purges. It was procedural, cumulative, and almost imperceptible. The overthrow occurred not in one moment, but in thousands of moments. Each small concession, each delayed report, each encouraged doubt, each reassigned loyalty, these were the threads that unraveled the king's authority. By the time the king realized the scope of his loss, the transfer of power was complete. What remained was appearance. What moved invisibly was reality. After the king's displacement, the advisor did not seize a crown. Instead, he embedded control within systems, councils, committees, reporting structures, and bureaucracies. Authority no longer required a single figure. It required procedure, adherence, and perception. The king had depended on symbols. The advisor depended on systems. This was his genius. Systems endure. Individuals do not. Orders are executed. Mistakes are mitigated. Influence is insulated. And power, once embedded, is harder to remove than the strongest army. The kingdom survived, prospered even, but at the cost of vitality. Leadership became functional rather than inspirational. Loyalty became conditional rather than heartfelt. Participation became procedural rather than engaged. Stability was achieved, but at the cost of identity. The advisor had secured order, but not belonging. Compliance replaced allegiance. Efficiency replaced passion. The advisor's rule demonstrated a paradox. Power can be consolidated, preserved, and prolonged, but it cannot create the imagination or devotion that charismatic authority once inspired. Even after the advisor's death, his influence persisted. Institutions continued, procedures remained, habits endured. Future rulers operated within the frameworks he had constructed. Proximity to decisions, control over information, and structured authority remained more important than charisma or inheritance. He had proven that power is not about the throne, it is about the invisible levers of decision. And those who control the levers shape history, often more effectively than kings or armies. As decades passed, the advisor's influence became inseparable from the kingdom itself. His decisions, once subtle, had crystallized into custom. What was once an individual strategy had become institutional memory. In this sense, he did not merely rule, he remade the state in his image. Legacy is rarely measured in monuments or monument stones. It is measured in continuity, in habits, in the unseen threads that bind decisions to outcomes long after the hands that first pulled them have gone. Power, when exercised quietly, can seem morally neutral. Yet the advisor's rise was ethically complex. He had not killed the king, nor forced him into exile. And yet, the crown had lost its meaning, and the king his influence. History rarely encounters morality in pure forms. It encounters consequence. The advisor's brilliance lay in avoiding direct confrontation, while ensuring that no direct challenge could succeed. He did not coerce, he guided. He did not intimidate, he structured dependency. The king fell not to violence, but to inevitability. The kingdom after the king had become an organism, alive not through emotion or devotion, but through networks of authority, bureaucracy, and procedure. Each office, each council, each law functioned like a pulse, moving the body without pause. The advisor had transformed leadership from art into architecture. The state endured because it had learned to operate independently of personalities. Yet within this endurance lay fragility. The system could survive, but it could not inspire. It could enforce, but it could not imagine. Every advisor leaves a lesson, often unspoken. In this kingdom, future generations studied the patterns he created: who spoke when, whose counsel was followed, how perception could be curated. Young ministers, courtiers, and bureaucrats learned by watching, absorbing the unspoken rules of influence. Control is learned by observation, perfected in practice. The silent transmission of tactics often shapes the next generation more than formal instruction. The cycle was ready to repeat. Wherever proximity and knowledge outpace authority, influence quietly accumulates. Though he wielded no crown, and commanded no army, the advisor's achievement was absolute. He had achieved what few rulers ever do: the seamless transition of authority into his hands without overt power, the embedding of influence within systems so that it would outlast him. Victory is often silent. Its impact measured not in noise, but in absence: the absence of resistance, the absence of recognition, the absence of disruption. The advisor's systems protected the state, but they also isolated him. Trust became rare. Companionship grew distant. Decisions he once influenced subtly now required constant vigilance. Authority became both armor and cage. Absolute influence isolates. Every shadow of control comes at the cost of connection. Even as the kingdom functioned smoothly, he understood the paradox: the closer one is to power, the further one may be from understanding those governed. Centuries later, the advisor's techniques became archetypal. Across empires, in courts, in bureaucracies, in corporations, the pattern repeats: proximity to information, subtle influence, and the slow accumulation of dependency become more decisive than formal authority. History is a cycle of visibility and invisibility, ceremony and subtlety, crowns and whispers. And yet, for every advisor who rises, there is a system prepared to absorb, resist, or eventually supplant them. Power is never static. It flows, accumulates, dissipates, and reforms. Power is a conversation. Not always spoken aloud, not always witnessed, but continuously negotiated between those who act, those who watch, and those who obey. The advisor understood this intimately. He never needed the crown, he needed only the channels through which decisions flowed, the perceptions he could shape, and the dependencies he could cultivate. Authority is seductive, yet fragile. Kings believed it permanent because it was visible. Advisors know it is fleeting because they measure it not in display, but in leverage. In the decades after the king's displacement, the advisor's network became the backbone of governance. Each minister, clerk, and envoy functioned as both agent and observer, reporting, coordinating, and managing the pulse of the kingdom. True power lies not in the one who sits, but in the one who ensures everything else moves. Even after the advisor's death, the system he had embedded ensured continuity. His hand was gone, but his method endured. Decisions flowed predictably, crises were absorbed efficiently, and governance remained steady. The advisor's coup was not sudden. It was evolutionary. He did not take the king's power, he waited for it to be seeded, step, by habit, by trust, by dependency. History remembers dramatic acts. Yet often the most profound transfers of authority occur quietly, almost imperceptibly, in a series of small, cumulative choices. In this sense, the advisor's triumph was not a moment, it was a process, perfected through patience, observation, and understanding human behavior. With the king's authority diminished, the kingdom did not collapse. It adapted. Governance became less about personality, more about procedure. Ritual replaced instinct. Networks replaced charisma. The advisor taught the kingdom to function without a king, and to survive without inspiration. Citizens complied, officials executed, and traditions persisted, but the sense of shared destiny had eroded. Stability replaced engagement, and efficiency replaced imagination. The advisor's influence extended far beyond his lifetime. Future rulers navigated within his system, constrained by the structures he had designed. Authority remained centralized procedurally, while charisma became irrelevant. He proved that the architecture of influence can outlast the architecture of crowns. Even centuries later, students of power study him, not for heroism or villainy, but as an archetype, the one who wielded control without visibility, shaped decisions without command, and ruled without a crown. And yet, the advisor's success is not purely a model to emulate. It is a cautionary tale. Power consolidated in silence creates efficiency, but also alienation. Order replaces engagement. Authority replaces loyalty. Compliance replaces belief. The advisor reminds us, systems can endure long after inspiration has faded, but no system can substitute entirely for the human spirit. Even as stability persists, history teaches that discontent quietly accrues. Influence, however subtle, leaves ripples across generations. History is a cycle. Advisors rise where kings trust too much, systems consolidate where authority is unchecked, and power moves quietly from those who inherit it to those who understand it. The story of this advisor is not confined to one kingdom, one era, or one man. It is a mirror of governance itself. Influence can outweigh ceremony, perception can outweigh position, and subtlety can outweigh force. Power is never static. It flows, adapts, and finds the path of least resistance. And those who understand its currents rise, often without recognition. Kings fall not only to armies, conspiracies, or rebellion. They fall when influence moves faster than authority. Advisors succeed not only by cunning, but by understanding the currents of trust, the rhythm of decision, and the patterns of human behavior. History remembers crowns. But power belongs to those who can shape it, often in silence, always in motion, and almost always unnoticed.